Okay, let's get started. We kind of have a lot to cover today. So let's make sure this is streaming, no dropped frames, perfect. It's picking up the audio, test, test, test. Okay, so assignment number 1 has been graded. If there were issues, I left notes. Make sure to take care of any notes that I left because all this material builds to more complex examples. So these assignment number 1 is considered like the fundamentals. And then from there, it's just assume that you know all those things and you're not going to have any issue with that. And then assignment number 2, let me edit this. So the first example that we do today is going to be the example you use for assignment number 2. So last week we kind of talked about the basics and how you could essentially plan out a site, but we're going to do something very similar today. 9:15, and I'll just let to know it's going to be the first example, example 1. And I'll read this after the example because it'll make more sense. And then note that that's due in 1 week. So let's just go ahead and get started with our coding here. So CGS4828, let's make a folder for today, which is 9/15/2020. Open up brackets. Go ahead and do file, open folder, and then point it to 9/15/2020. File, new, and then under links, we have our HTML shell. Grab that, copy, and paste. And this will be ex1.html. One of the things I noticed on the first assignment is some indentation issues. Remember that we have this extension that should handle a lot of these. So under Extension Manager, I've already got it installed. It's called Beautify. But if you go to Available and start typing it in, it's pretty easy to install. You just click the Install button. Okay. And while you're getting that set up, I'm going to go over to W3 Schools. So we're going to be under HTML. It actually technically might be under CSS. Yeah. So I'm under W3 Schools, click CSS. And last time we talked about the box model. And the idea with the box model is that we have all these block level elements, div, section, article, h1. Most of the elements that we've actually talked about so far have been block level. And they inherently have some properties associated with them. So we have our content. So if you think of a paragraph, the content would be the paragraph. Then we have some invisible thing called a border. Well, it's invisible by default. We can actually view it if we want. We can change it with some CSS. We have some stuff between the content and the border. That area is called padding. And then between the border and the, I guess we'll say the outside world, so either the edge of the page or other elements, that's called margin. And last time what we did was a technique where we said, okay, what we can do is we can make one of these and we don't really make one, it's just kind of inherent with a, like say for example, a div. And then what we can do is we can set it to a fixed width. We can do things like set the margin to auto, which automatically puts it in the center of the page, and so on. So we're going to be building upon that. So let's kind of just get a basic skeleton of what our page is going to look like. The idea is that it's going to have a header, which is going to serve as like a banner, and let's just say it says IRC across the top. And then underneath that, we're going to have some navigation. And then we're going to have some main content. And on your assignment, you'll have to add a footer, but I'm going to leave the footer off so that gives you kind of something to work with for your assignment. Okay, so we start off with, we have a header. And inside of that header, you might just say IRC, but just because I know ahead of time what we're going to be doing, I'm going to put that inside of a div. And we'll have it say Indian River State College. So remember, I could have used a div for everything, and I used to do that more often. I'm trying to make use of some of these HTML5 elements that better describe the content. Okay, so we've got our header. Then we're going to have some sort of navigation. We'll get into that in a minute. Then we're going to have some main area where we have some content. So let's handle these one at a time. So the first thing I want to do is take care of this header. And this actually might be a good example of when to use an ID, but I'm going to, because we're not really using JavaScript in this course, I'm just going to make life a little bit simpler and use classes for everything. So let's say it's a part of a class called banner. Make sure we're still streaming. Perfect. Not dropping frames. Okay. And then what we'll do is inside of this section here, head, we do style. And then to create a banner, to create a class, remember we do dot, the class name, and then curly braces, and then whatever in the curly braces is going to be applied to that class banner. And let's just do some basic stuff with colors. Let's say, for example, we want the, sorry, let me mute my phone. So we'll set a background color. This will be fine. So a common technique is to set some dark background color with white text. So we'll say the text color, which is just color. It's white. You could do some sort of off-white if you want. I'm just going to... in the real world, you tend to put a lot more effort into the colors, and you probably use hex values or RGB values, but just to keep the lecture moving, I like to just use predefined colors. Okay, so that should be a good starting point. Let's see what it looks like. Okay, so we got that, and maybe make the size larger and make it bold. So we can say that the font weight is going to be bold. And the font size, something fairly large, let's see, 50 pixels. And again, I'm not putting too much thought into the details. This is just to kind of get us going. So that should be large enough, that should be good. So here we've got our header, and really it's serving as the banner, so I'm going to call it our banner. And then within that, just because I know from experience that we're going to need to do some stuff inside of here, I wrap this in a div. And this will make sense why we did this in a little bit. Now, one thing that you should notice is that there's a tiny bit of margin. It's either margin or padding between here. And remember that by default, we get some styling that we didn't really ask for, because remember, going all the way back to the original HTML is that we didn't have CSS available, so they actually did styling inside of HTML. So one of the most common things that I do is when I start a page is I say that within the HTML and body elements, get rid of margin. Actually, we don't even actually need to write pixels. Just 0 is 0, whether it's 0 EM or 0 pixels, 0%. And padding. So 0 out the margin and padding. So one of those things, I don't even really think about it too much anymore. when I start a page, I just 0 out both of those. And it just makes sure that we don't have any stray margin or padding around the edge of our page. Notice that goes all the way to the edge. Now this works okay, but a very common technique is to have the background span the full width of the page, but then come up with like this invisible container from like here to here, let's say 700 pixels. And so let's go ahead and do that. So we're going to have a container. We're going to use this container over and over and over again. So maybe I should put it kind of near the top because we're going to work with it so much. So we're going to have a class called container. And it's going to be, it's going to serve as that fixed width thing with the box model that we did last week, where I say, okay, I want it to be a fixed width. And I'm going to set the margin to auto so it forces it to the middle of the page. Remember, if we have, normally it wants to take up the entire width of the page and then drop down to a new line. But once we've set the width, it takes up the full width. It still drops to the next line, but what we can do is say, okay, well, since I've got a fixed width, any extra margin, I want to evenly space on the left and the right. So what we can do is we can say margin is auto, and we won't visually see anything yet because we haven't applied that anywhere. But the basic idea is that we kind of have this invisible thing going through the middle of the page. So I could, so don't type this because I'm going to get rid of it. I could apply the container here. Remember that we can actually apply multiple classes. All we have to do is separate it with a space. So we're saying use the banner and the container classes here. But this isn't what I said we want to do. We want to have this background span the full width while having Indian River State College within this container. It's not quite centered. Notice that it's going to be more toward the left. So we're not centering it, even though it might sort of look like that. So what we want to do is we say, okay, this is going to have the banner, but the actual container, I want to apply that here. And that's why I gave us this div, because I knew ahead of time, just from experience, that this is very common, is that we've got some sort of full width thing. In this case, it's the banner, but then we want to constrain some sort of content. And anytime we want to constrain it, we use this technique. Now notice that we've got a full width background, and maybe we could add a little bit of, just so we get some practice with it, inside of our banner to maybe add some padding as well. Remember, the padding is from the content to the inside edge of the border. Let's see what that gives us. Maybe a little bit smaller. Yeah, that's close enough. Okay. You can mess with these individual pixel values. I'm just looking for rough estimates. Okay, so just to give a quick review, what we did was we created a header, and then within that header we had some sort of content. And I kind of just ahead of time knew that we would probably need to throw that inside of a div, so I did that. Now you could have possibly thrown this inside of an H1. I'm always a little bit hesitant to use H1s because they have default styling that can be annoying to use. So even though it probably realistically might have been best as an H1, I was kind of lazy and threw it inside of a div. Now there are reset scripts where we can reset a lot of styling, and I tend to like to use these, but I'm trying to make this class a little bit less complicated. So, and then what we did is we made a banner, which was going to be a full width background color. And notice that even though we defined banner up here, so our text color, because this is a child, this div is within it, it got that CSS property applied to it. So we didn't actually have to apply it to container, because we want to leave container generic. We want to be able to reuse container. And then, so all this stuff applied here. So the font weight, the font size, all that stuff, even though we defined it in banner, because this little bit of text right here is a direct, or I shouldn't say direct, it's a child, it's an eventual child of banner. It has to go through here first, but it gets all that applied to it. Okay, and then what we did is we said, okay, we could apply container to this header, but if you remember from the example a minute ago, it kind of applied the background color too, which we didn't want. We wanted the background color to be the full width. So we applied it here, and we forced the content, this text, we forced that to be inside of this container. I guess we can go ahead and so nav is a little bit complicated, but I was thinking for a second if I wanted to just skip to main, but we'll handle nav first. So a very common thing to do with navigation is to put it inside of an unordered list. And then each link is going to be a list item. Now I could write the full thing, href, all that. What I'll do instead is I'll just put actual text here. But in the real world, you would actually have to write the full ahref equals. It's just probably going to make this example a little bit messy, so we'll cheat a little bit. So let's just put some sample links here. Okay, 4 is a good number. So we've got a navigation that's inside of an unordered list, and then our individual links are list items. And if we view that without any styling, it's going to be a little bit weird. What we want to do is put it maybe kind of here, going horizontally. We want to get rid of the bullets. There's going to be a lot of styling associated with that. So let's do this. On our nav, let's give that a class called primary nav. If you remember last class, and I think I've mentioned this a few times, what we want to avoid is giving it names like top nav, because we may change the CSS later. So I like the name primary nav. And now we have to actually go up in here here and start doing some stuff with it. See if I can get both on the screen at the same time. Perfect. So notice that even though we have this nav, let's say for example, let's just tackle the easy stuff first. I want to get rid of the bullet points. I don't really want to apply them here. I want to apply them on this UL. So what we can do is we can say, okay, within the class primary nav, if I have a UL inside of that, which we do, right? So here we have primary nav, and then this UL, I want to set the, I think it's called list style type. I want to set that to none. Because nav doesn't itself have bullet points, it'd be kind of a weird thing to set it there. So this is very common. You say the UL within this class. Now, in this case, we could have maybe used an element selector because there's only one nav, but we may add additional navigation later. So I like this idea of having a class called primary nav. Now we could have created another class called like primary nav UL or something awkward like that, but this tends to work pretty well because really primary nav is like, it's got a bunch of things in it. And so rather than creating a bunch of new classes, which I've been guilty of in the past, let's just say, okay, look at that primary nav class. Well, it's going to have a UL inside of it. Let's apply things to that UL. Makes it a little bit more natural that we can apply the primary nav here than trying to apply it here. Okay, so that gets rid of our bullet points. Now, something that's not going to be super apparent inside of our built-in web server. So what I want to do is open this example, and I'm going to go to our developer tools. And I'm not expecting you to open this on your own browser. I just kind of want you to watch here. As I hover over the UL, what do you notice on the left-hand side of that? You see a bunch of purple, correct? And if I go over on the bottom right-hand side of the screen, what is purple? Oh, it's telling me that on the left-hand side, so on the top, bottom, and right, those are all set to 0. But you can see here on the left-hand side of padding, it's set to 40. So by default, a list gets 40 pixels of padding. I want to get rid of that. So we go back up here and we say, okay, padding. I could say padding left, but just all around. I don't want any padding. And I refresh, and you can see it's gone. And you can see here it's set to 0. So we're getting there. One thing, well, let me come back to that. So you'll notice that it probably makes sense aligned here within our container, but it's all the way over here. So what can we do? We can say, I guess we can apply it on this. We can say that this UL is going to be inside the container. We could have probably applied it to either equally. I'm just going to make the decision to put it at the UL. So what I'm saying here is that, okay, this class container, which was fixed with and had a margin of auto, I want to put this stuff inside of that. And then notice that we get that alignment. Now, I generally don't like doing things without really explaining them, but I'm going to use something that we're going to talk about in the next couple weeks called Flexbox. So don't worry that most of you probably won't know what's going on here. What I'm going to do is under our navigation, I'm going to set the display to flex, which is short for Flexbox. And then I'm going to justify the content to be space between. Now that probably doesn't make sense, but you can at least see the end result. The end result is now that we've taken that thing and we've made it horizontal, which is, by the way, very interesting because think about how much we styled this bulleted list, which now looks nothing like a list, but it is a list. It's a list of links. And so what we've done is we've just used some styling to make it look more like a navigation and less like a bulleted list. And that's what I always say is that define what the thing is ahead of time. So if it's an unordered list, make it an unordered list. But because you can always use CSS to basically do whatever you want with it. And you notice that this looks way different than our normal bulleted list. Okay. but we're actually going to spend an entire class, maybe a class and a half, just on Flexbox. So, and I think that's it for this part. Okay, so we've got our header, we've got our navigation. Now I'm not going to style this at all. These little things like this, I would suggest these would be good things for your assignment. We'll talk about the assignment in a minute. But I'm leaving some things very much unstyled so that you can go through and maybe add some padding, maybe turn these into working links, maybe have like a mouse hover effect to where like as you hover it, it underlines it. So just some things to think about. Okay, so we've got our header, we've got our nav. Now main. What we want to do inside of main is we want to have like a 2-column design. And I already know that I want main to kind of be in the center here. Something like this. So I'm going to put main inside of that container class. Now notice what I could have probably done is wrap the whole page in a giant div and made everything inside of the container. But this is nice because this gives us more options. We can use container on an as needed basis. Because your footer, well, we've already seen banner on the header, why we might need it inside of somewhere else. Same thing with the footer. But it just makes it so that we have more options. We're not always locked into this. The entire page is a fixed width. We can let some things expand the full width and some things be constrained to a container. And with our 2 columns, we're going to have 2 different sections. Doesn't really matter what they are. So let's just define those. Now, very generically, I'm going to say that each of these columns is a box. And to make that 2-column design, well, let's do this. Let's go ahead and define box. So what is box? Box is just a fixed width, in this case section, just a fixed width element, fixed width block level element. Now our total container width, if you remember up here, is 700 pixels, which we could just say, okay, 350, 350. I generally don't like to do that. I like to subtract a few pixels just so we have, just because every once in a while there's certain things about the box model we get stray pixels. I don't want to really get into it. It's just easier just to subtract some pixels. Now, I don't normally do this. It's kind of bad practice, but let's give it a height as well. Let's say 400 pixels. And then let's see the actual border around this. We're going to get rid of border and height eventually once we actually put in real content. Sorry, it's solid red. And if we bring this up, we see that they are stacked. So right now it's a 1-column design. How do we make these side by side for 2-column? What we can do is we can apply float left and float right. And let me just do this. Let me make, I don't like to make too many additional classes, but let's do call 1, and that's going to be float left. Call 2, float right. And I don't really know. I don't really like the names col1, col2, because that's not going to make sense if we don't have a 2-column design anymore. But let's leave it like that for now. We can fix things later. So what we can actually do is we can apply multiple classes. So we can say it's part of box and col1, box and col2. One of the things that we have to do when we're using these floats is use that clear fix hack. So we say div style is equal clear both. So we've used floats here and here. Here we're just saying that, okay, we're done using floats. Go back to normal document flow. And you'll see here that we've got a 2-column design. Now this floating technique really only works for 2 columns. And to be honest, I don't use it very often anymore. We have more powerful tools, but those tools are more complicated. They require an entire lecture or two to go over grids. But this is pretty simple technique, just using stuff you already know, which I think most people already did, like floats in like CGS4828. And then from there, we could start to add more content. For example, I could put in, H1. And let's say that this box is having to talk about stuff regarding spring registration. This one is about the Aspen Award. Notice that this is getting a little difficult to read, so what I always like to do is just put some spaces in where necessary. To me, that's a little bit easier to read. Now you'll notice that this H1, like I mentioned before, it has some default styling. So if I go back over here and I find inside of main section H1, notice that we see lots of yellow. What's yellow? Well, I go over here on the bottom right and I see, okay, well, yellow is margin. So what we want to do is that we want to go up here and we say that, okay, within box, find an H1. Get rid of that margin. Okay, perfect. Now we might want to do something where we kind of, since it's like a title, match this up here. So we can do that. We can say, okay, and remember we used cadet blue. And just kind of do the same thing, do font, weight, bold, set some sort of I don't even know if we, actually no, sorry, by default it's bold, so we don't even need that. And then the text color, white. And then even within that, maybe you want to center it, add some padding. Just to give you some ideas. And then just to give you some extra stuff that you could do on your assignment, I would suggest like doing up here where we did some padding, do the same thing here. So we're getting there. This is kind of the base for a basis for a site. By the way, I know this example is run kind of long, but it's good to go through very long examples sometimes. And as usual, I'll post the code. And then very last thing, maybe we want to add an image. So remember here, we had these different sites from lorem ipsum. Rather than going to the site, what I'm going to do is just under links, I actually gave you the direct link. So you can just copy that. And underneath this, we might have an image and then some other text. So say image source equals. So this just ensures that we get the same image every time, because there are times where I want to look at something and it can be a little bit confusing when the image changes every single time, so I just grab the first cat. This is the width and this is the height. So what we could do is we could say, okay, well, what's the width that we're dealing with? So our box is 330 pixels. So what we could do is we could say, okay, 330, and in the real world what you'd do is open up your photo editing program and then resize it so it's 330 pixels. Okay, so that works. That's one way. And let's do that twice. Actually, we'll just leave it for once because we're gonna change some things. Well, what happens if we are using a larger image? Say 400 pixels wide, it overflows. It's very common, we're going to get into responsive designs and much more dynamic pages. It's very common that you don't want to have to necessarily create an image cropped to exact pixels for every single usage. Now, you don't want to use a gigantic original. That's another problem, is because it loads the entire image, and you might have like a 10 meg image or something like that. But usually you can get an approximation, just like an order of magnitude to deal with. So what we have is I don't know if I have a link directly available. W. So there's a CSS property called object fit, and I'll add a direct link later. But for right now, you can just do W3 Schools object fit cover. And what we can do is we can make the object fit however we want to. So by default, what we can see is that it overflowed, which is probably not very good. Let's look at our different options. So what I want to do first thing is I want to set up some CSS for this. So underneath box H1, let's stay a little organized. I could say within the box, look at the image. And there's some property called object fit. And we see all of our different options. Let's see what contain does. So one quick note, this object fit tends to only really work if you get it something like how much to fit, essentially. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, I want the width to be, so let's do that. We'll talk about the height first. I want to give it a height, let's say, so we have, let's say 100 pixels. And then just fill the width fully. So what I'm doing is I'm constraining the height to a pixel value and the width to a percentage value, 100%. Notice that it kind of rescaled it for us. It didn't really do necessarily the best thing. It didn't overflow, but it kept the same aspect ratio and just kind of put the image there. And that one was contain. The one I like to use a lot, here we go. Okay, so by default it's fill. the replaced content is scaled to maintain its aspect ratio while fitting within the elements box. Perfect. The one I like to use a lot is cover. Cover keeps the original image, and then it kind of, so the object will be clipped to fit. Let's do this. So we'll set it to cover. Now you'll notice that that extra part is actually clipped, but we've kept the original image. And let me make it a little bit, so let's say 200 pixels. Okay, so we'll flip back and forth. By default, it's fill. Let's do this. Let's get rid of all this. So by default, this is what the image looks like. Notice that just beyond the ear, we've got some extra fur here. But when I set it to, oops, Control Z, okay. When I set it to cover, it clipped all that extra bits off. Okay, this tends to work pretty well. Usually you kind of have to choose your images in a certain way, and you have to kind of think a little bit ahead of time. With this lorem ipsum for images, these are just stock images, so it doesn't work perfect, but usually you put a little bit of thought into it, but you get the idea. Okay, so I want to do a quick 5-minute review of everything we did. This is going to serve as the basis of your assignment. So what you'll do is use that as a starting point. And then I want you to go in and I'm going to edit this. I don't want to do the background color. So this is going to be your starting point. We didn't use a background color, so I'm going to get rid of this. And it's assumed white background. The inner okay, so the inner boxes, these two things, I want you to look up, there's a CSS property to round these corners. So I want you to go ahead and do that. Create a banner, we already did that. Use the nav. So additionally, I want you to add the footer. The styling should match the header. Okay, so using the footer, add some footer information. Usually you just say something generic like copyright 2020. The styling should match the header. Okay, so to take you through this, what you'll do is take this base thing right here. So the first thing is for these boxes, look up, there's a CSS property to round these out. Okay, that's a very common thing, is that you'll do a very, very gentle rounding of these here. Add a footer that's going to sort of match this styling, so make sure to use container. It's going to be the full width, and then you're going to have the container in here. You could just have it say something generic like copyright 2020. And then take these other parts of the page and add more styling to them. So the one that seems most obvious to me would be this nav right here. This is going to need some additional styling. Maybe add some paragraphs with lorem ipsum. Maybe take this image, also add another image here. Okay, you get the idea. Okay. And what I'll probably do here is, I'll do this after class, but I'll extend the due date to, I guess, that Friday. just for the people online or watching from home. But, yeah, okay, so that's your assignment. You get the basic idea, is that you're going to use this as your starting point and expand upon that. And I give those some details on how to expand in the assignment. So we've got a little less than a half an hour. Okay, so let's talk about, let's go to, so I'm under CSS. So W3 Schools, let's click CSS. And we want to talk about these things called media queries. So in the old days of web development, not even that long ago, maybe a little bit more than 10 years, I think web development had very much stabilized. What people would do is they would create a fixed width page, sort of like what we did in our example. And because it was fixed width, however I viewed it on my browser was essentially how it would look to everyone else. And what would happen is that this container, so notice that this is still, everything's relatively the same, and as I expand it, all that happens is that we get more background color, but the actual container is, everything's all still in the same relative position. It's just we just have some extra margin on the edges that we're expanding and getting rid of. Now obviously it would cause problems at this resolution, but back in those days we didn't have very many monitor resolutions. We would have monitors anywhere from like 14 or 15 inches up to like 19 inches. Like there wasn't a huge variance in the monitors. Let's just pick a date. Let's say 2005. You didn't have a huge variance in the size of monitors. Most people were using a desktop or maybe a laptop. At that point, I think the iPhone came out in 2007, and so people weren't really viewing websites on mobile devices. Well, what's happened since then? Since then, we have, from the smallest mobile phone to these gigantic 4K monitors, we have huge differences in the sizes of screens and the resolution of screens. So now we can't just design one site anymore. So around after the original iPhone came out, and then we started to see the popularity of some other like Android phones, what people would do was, so by default to view these websites you'd have to do this like pinch zoom thing where you'd go to the site and you'd have to scroll into the content. And I'm sure, I don't even know if anybody remembers that. It's been so long. What people would do is they would create a separate mobile site, which is not ideal because essentially you're doubling your effort. And so somewhere around 2012, we came up with this idea of responsive web design. That's essentially keeping the same site, but coming up with methods to slightly change things based on these screen resolutions. So I don't even have to worry about whether it's mobile specifically, like if it's an iPhone or an iPad. Really all I do is care about, okay, general, very like order of magnitude screen resolutions. Very broadly, maybe like mobile phones to tablets and smaller laptops to desktops, and then maybe all the way up to like TVs. And the idea is that once we hit something like, say, this, where 2 columns maybe doesn't make sense anymore, what we can do is we can apply CSS, which makes this drop down to a 1-column design. We don't have to redo the entire site. We just have to put little bits of CSS here and there. Now, how do we do that? How do we detect all that? We use something called media queries. And the way a media query works is, let's start with this right here. Media queries, simple example. So we've got our normal CSS right here. Then we have this @media. This @media means that we have a media query. Then what happens is it says, okay, don't worry about the screen. It's saying the device needs to be the minimum width, 480 pixels. So if the minimum width is 480 pixels, apply light green. But normally it gets pink. So notice as I change this, oh, there we go, sorry. I was reading the rule backwards. So what it's saying is, and I usually like to flip these, I like to say max width up to, but essentially what's happening here is that it's saying, okay, normally it's pink. So normally it's this. As soon as we hit 480 pixels or larger, so at least 480 pixels, make the background color green. Now in practice we don't change colors. This is just kind of a simple example. What we do tend to do is do things like say, okay, this is no longer going to be a 2-column design. Let's make this a single column design. It probably has some other stuff here. So they've got some examples. But that's all right. So let's use that in our page. So let's start a new example. We'll go to File, New, and let's just copy and paste all of example 1 since that's a good example just to start with. So I'm going to do Control A, Control C, or if you're on a Mac, it's going to be Command A, Command C, and then paste it in with Control or Command V as in Victor. I'm going to save this as ex2.html. So same exact site as before. And I've already sort of told you that this works for, let's say, desktop and laptops, but as soon as we hit something very narrow, let's say, for example, mobile phones, 2 columns doesn't really work anymore. You don't tend to see 2 columns very often, 2 or 3 or more. By the way, once we get into grid, we're going to get into like 4 columns and stuff like that. You can't really do that very easily with float. You can do it, it's just kind of messy. And so what we want to say is, okay, once I hit a certain width, just collapse these 2 columns down to 1 single column. Okay, so what I'll do is, these are our default rules, and then what we do is underneath that, we put @media, and then we say what our rule is. Now they said the minimum width. I like to flip it, so I'm going to say the maximum width. So up to, so from 0 to this, so essentially mobile phones. Now we already have our container, which is 700 pixels. So to me that seems like a good width to say. Okay, so 700 pixels. Oops. So @media max dash width 700 pixels. Now this isn't going to necessarily work just as is. We have to add one more thing up here, because even our basic mobile phones have a huge number of pixels on them. So it's a little bit like if we just relied on pixels alone, it's not going to work. What we have is this idea of device-independent pixels. And it's like basically the mobile phone and mobile device manufacturers say, okay, yeah, this is technically a pixel, But when you're creating a website, because this is such a high resolution phone, it's a very, very dense pixel phone, that maybe actually 5 pixels is 1 pixel. So to do that, what you have to do is use this thing right here. So if we go back to HTML shell, it's called viewport meta. Now, for whatever reason, they make this kind of difficult. So what we can do is we can just Google for, actually it's probably in W3 Schools. Yeah, so if you, under CSS, if we go down to responsive design, under viewport, you can read the details about viewport, but what we have to do is we have to set this property right here. So under setting the viewport, we can just copy and paste this. Essentially, this enables those device-independent pixels for us. And then we can just paste that right here is good. Don't worry about what this means. Just know that if you're doing responsive design, which is what this is called, we have to set this meta viewport. Now, the most obvious thing to me is that I want to collapse this 2 columns into 1. So what I want to say is this column 1 and column 2, it's not going to float anymore. So what I can actually do is just say float none. Same thing with column 2. Now, hopefully you see why column 1, column 2 is a bad name, because it's no longer a 2-column design, but we didn't have real content. Usually you would call it the real content name, like admissions and, you know, whatever the other one was, Aspen Prize, I think. And now what will happen, if I typed everything correctly, notice that it goes from 2 columns to 1 column. But normally we don't really just leave this fixed width like this. What do? When we have a 1-column design, we usually just say, okay, let it fill the full width. We don't really need a fixed width element anymore. And that was under box. So we had this and this in box was fixed width. But now what I want to do is go up here and say, actually now the box has a width of 100%. It's not great to hard code the height, but we don't really have enough content to fill it out. So if you remember from before, we had hard coded our height. So we're saying, okay, the width is no longer 330 pixels. I want the width to just be 100%. Notice that this image thing that we worked on earlier works really well because we didn't have to create a separate image. It just kind of worked because we set the object fit to cover. Now, again, this is not a great example because these are like stock images. Usually you go to some effort to take an image and then just have a bunch of, like, a core focus of the image and then just maybe some stuff that can easily get cropped out. So we're getting there. So let me go over this again. With this media query, it says, okay, these are all the rules for our page. Now, if I'm dealing with a device that's between 0 and 700 pixels, what I want to do is I want to go back and overwrite the column class. It's not going to float anymore. Same thing with the box. The box isn't going to be fixed width anymore either. Now we're sort of getting there, but we're dealing with some issues with this container class. Notice that we get the left and right scroll bars. The reason is because that container class was a fixed width. So what we can do is, I'll put this up here. We can say, okay, the container is no longer 700 pixels. The container is just 100%. It's the full width of the page. And then notice that it still has some scroll bars left and right because we've probably got some stray pixels that we could, if we really wanted. It looks like the red is what's causing the problem. That's all right, we could fix that. But you can get the idea that it's not. Notice that our navigation is properly collapsing. And same thing, even if we ran out of room for the width here, Indian River State College would properly collapse. I think it's these red borders, and we honestly really don't really need them anymore, so let's see if that's causing the problem. Yeah. That's what, by the way, that's what I was talking about earlier when I say we get little stray pixels here and there. A lot of times it has to do with the border. There's a property that you can set, I can't remember the name off the top of my head, to not have that behavior, but it's fine. Okay, so we'll get into more detail next week. But this is basically media queries. It's this idea that we have our CSS styles, and then we can overwrite those, and we don't have to overwrite everything. We could just say, okay, just this one thing inside of box. Box had a bunch of different properties, but the only property I want to change within box when I get to small devices is the width. Now, one thing to note is that the ordering of this does matter. So if you put these media queries at the top, it's going to act different. I generally just put them at the bottom. You've got your regular page, and then in this case, because you're saying max width, so we're saying from 0 to 700 pixels, which is going to be, let's say, mobile devices. Then we start to have mobile device specific rules. And notice that just in a few lines of code, we are able to keep the same original site without having to make a whole second website, which used to be very common, is that people would have mobile specific versions of the site. Okay, so I know we did two kind of complicated examples today. Maybe the second was just taking the first complicated example, but as usual, I will post the code. So that is going to serve as the basis for your assignment. Notice that I did make some slight changes to the assignment to better match what we did in class today. So I'll read this since we have a few minutes. So using the technique from today, from example 1, create a fixed width landing page, so like a home page. Use CSS where possible, and so on. So those two inner boxes that we created should have rounded corners. So you're going to have to add that additionally. We already created the banner. You can make some changes if you want to make it fit your site a little bit better. Same thing with the nav. We already created that. Create a simple navigation. You don't have to use drop-down menus. And then clean that navigation up. Make it look a little bit more like a real navigation. So just some hints. Change the fonts, colors, those sorts of things. Let's go back to the original version. You can see that's probably not good. Okay, add some margins, colors, font sizes, so on. Maybe even some of those properties for links, like there are the pseudo classes where you can like hover. So maybe you hover and have it have a underline underneath. And then finally, a footer, and I want the footer styling to match the header as much as possible. Now, what you'll notice is that by default, if you try to add a footer, it's actually up here. The thing that you want to search for, if you want the footer all the way forced to the bottom, which is probably what you want, is a either fixed footer or sticky footer. I get the two confused. So look at both. They behave slightly differently. They depending on when you have a lot of content on your page, they actually behave a little bit different. But that's the term. It's either sticky footer or fixed footer. I want to say it's fixed footer. Okay, and then part of your grade is just overall effort. Like if you just took this example and changed like one thing, you would still get a passing grade probably. Like if you just added the footer and rounded the corners, you'd still get a passing grade. But I want you to put some effort into it because I realize some of these techniques are complicated, so I can't really have you come up with a blank slate. So I give you kind of a starting point, and I want you to kind of use this to fill it up. Because in the real world, that's what you'd do, is you'd use known examples that you either learned in school or that you found elsewhere. And you got to get good at being able to read the classes, know what everything does, and be able to make modifications to that. Okay. So that's a good stopping point. Let me make sure here. Good. Didn't drop any frames today. Perfect. Okay. Any questions on anything? You good? Okay. So as usual, email me if you get confused at all about anything, and make sure that you look at the announcements, because I may, well, at the very least, I know I'm going to change the due date. I may, if anything's unclear with the assignment, I might post something as an announcement. Okay, so that's pretty much it for today. So be safe, and if anything comes up that you need to get a hold of me, just send me